The Jews of Italy don't eat matzo balls. Most people think that matzo balls are a Jewish dish, but the Jews of Italy have no idea about matzo balls. They have no ideas about any of the dishes that Ashkenazi Jews eat, because they had their own very special cuisine. And what I set out to describe on top of, that very special cuisine is how also the Jews influenced Italian cuisine, because Italian cuisine is a really wide label when you think about it, and it's very easy to paint Italian food with a broad brush and, be like, it's the country of pizza and pasta and, all of those, cliches. However, when you look deeper into the history and the culture of Italy, you can really find some point of intersection where the Jewish culture and the Italian culture have mixed, and that mixture has given rise to really interesting culinary experiences. So that's what we're going to set out to discuss today. Before we do that, I need you to keep a couple of dates in mind. I don't like to bore people with a lot of history because I know that not everybody is a history geek like myself. However, there's a few of these dates that I want you guys to keep in mind, because when we talk about food, the history comes into play sometimes. It's not all of the dates that I have on the screen. Those would be too many for you to probably remember, but I'll narrow it down to a couple. I ask you to remember 1492, which is when the Alhambra decree came to be. Now, most people don't call it the Alhambra decree, but we're talking about when the Jews were expelled from Spain. You might have heard of that historical event. The reason why the expulsion of Jews from Spain is relevant, and I ask you to keep it in mind real quick, is that southern Italy at that time belonged to the Kingdom of Spain. So whatever happened to the Jews of Spain affected the Jews of southern Italy too. So that's one date I ask you to keep in mind. And then the other two things that I ask you to keep in mind very much are the creation of the ghettos in Venice and Rome, respectively in 1516 and 1555. We don't need the exact date, but you want to keep the notion of ghetto in mind as we go into the discussion of food in the context of Italy, because first of all, you might know, but you might not know, so I'm just going to tell you, ghettos were invented in Italy. The word itself, ghetto, comes from the Venetian dialect, because that was the very first ghetto ever created. It's not a great thing that we're gonna, credit Italians with, not a great initiative. However, when it comes to food, the existence of ghettos has a silver lining, because a lot of the dishes that now we consider Jewish were born out of the ghetto experience, were born out of the separation between Jews and Christians, and were preserved thanks to the ghetto experience. Because if had the Jews been able to really mingle with the Christians and have a regular life, a lot of these recipes and stories would have sort of gotten lost. While the existence of some form of enclosure where the Jews were kept somehow preserved and allowed us to cherish further a lot of traditions. So we want to keep the ghettos in mind, and I'll tell you more about it as we go on. I'll skip the rest of the dates. I might come back to them later, depending whether we need them or not. But this is it. Just keep these ones in mind. So when I started to write this book, my editor was a really patient woman because she had to deal with a lot of editing. She asked me to really narrow down, what do I call Jewish Italian food? And there's a few aspects to what we call Jewish Italian food when you think about it. Because first of all, it's whatever, for example, we eat day in, day out in a Jewish household. But that could be the same as what they eat in a Christian household, right? We all eat pasta with tomato, you know what I mean? It could be anything. So there's the dishes that everybody eats also in a Jewish household. Then there's the dishes that have a Jewish history. So Jewish where the preparation or the ingredients or the techniques specifically belong to the Jewish culture. Then there are the dishes that we prepare for the holidays. So that's another set of recipes and stories that I really wanted to record. However, on top of that, there is another aspect that I thought was really interesting, which is how did the Jews influence Italian food and how did Italians influence Jewish food? So, as we will see later, this influence really goes both ways. So let's tackle the first way with the picture that you see here to the right. This is a dish that you might be familiar with. These are orecchiette. They're a shape of pasta. Most of those of you who, for example, whose families come from southern Italy, you might be familiar with them. They come from Apulia, from the region of Apulia. Now, yes, but no. They do come from the region of Apulia. They make them. They're a local specialty. However, that's not where the dish came from. The people of Apulia are really proud of it and they really think they invented it. But from a historical perspective, that's not entirely true. Orecchiette translates, for those of you who don't speak Italian, orecchiette translates to little ears. Ears as in the one around your face. Now, there's pretty much only one religion that I'm aware of where we celebrate a holiday, which is Purim, by eating symbolically the ears of our enemy. There's this dish also in contemporary Jewish cuisine called the ears of Aman. Aman was an evil guy that tried to kill the Jews. Turns out that the orecchiette, the tiny ears, were a dish that the Jews of France prepared to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Purim. Now, those Jews from France at some point settled in Italy. And they settled, guess where? In Apulia. So they brought with them this dish, which they made in Provence, in southern France. They brought it to Apulia. Apulians liked it, great, adopted it thoroughly with great excitement. So now we think of it as an Apulian dish. However, this dish has a Jewish history. And that Jewish history, for some reason, has gotten completely lost. Now, the reason why that history has gotten completely lost, I like to think, is the fact that the Jewish community of Italy is very small and not very culturally present, I want to say. Like, there's 35,000 Jews in Italy. It's not many in the entirety of the country. To give you a sense of proportion, in an American city, not a big one, there would be more Jews. So we're talking small American city versus entirety of a country. So we're not a big community. We're a small bunch of people. We're not very vocal. We're not very visible. So it's no wonder that through history, some of the Jewish contribution to Italian food and culture, as well as the Jewish contribution to a number of other sectors of culture, has been sort of gone lost, because pretty much we don't have a voice. So when I set out to write my book, the idea was to give the Jews of Italy a voice, or at least some visibility from a cultural perspective. Now, the story of the orecchiette is just one of the very many stories, so let me give you a few more. Another really interesting story I find is the history of eggplant. Eggplant as an ingredient has been historically mistreated by Italians. Today we think of eggplant as an Italian ingredient. We think of it as, you know, the ingredient that goes into pasta alla norma, that goes in melanzana alla parmigiana. However, eggplants were not always a favorite Italian ingredient. All the way until the 17th centuries, Italians thought that eggplants were a very suspicious vegetable. They thought they could be perhaps poisonous. That's why we call it melanzana. The word melanzana comes from the combination of mela, which is apple, and insana, which is crazy. People thought that eggplants were potentially poisonous apples type of thing. So they were very hesitant to adopt eggplants. Now, who cooked with eggplants on a regular basis? The Jews, because the Jews had learned to cook with eggplants through their exchanges with the Arab world. The Jews traveled to Turkey, they traveled to Morocco, they traveled to all of those countries where eggplants were a very appreciated vegetable. So when we, for example, we remember what I told you about when the expulsion of the Jews happened from Spain, a number of those Jews settled in Sicily. Some of the Sicilian Jews, who were also expelled from Spain, moved up north in the rest of the peninsula. And one of the ingredients that they brought with them was especially eggplant. Now, it took centuries for Italians to take up eggplant as an ingredient. There were some wealthy people that had learned the usage of eggplant, but Italy as a whole, as a country, was very skeptical of eggplants. So it was pretty much the Jews that taught Italians how to cook this ingredient and how to make the most of it. To the point that, for example, when you look at caponata, which is the dish that I have here in the picture on the left, again, we think of it as a Sicilian specialty, but it was pretty much the Sicilian Jews that prepared this dish. Later on, it was more widely adopted and more widely accepted, but that wasn't always the case. So again, I set out to try and shed some light over how the Jews really influenced the way we cook, because we couldn't think of Italian food today without eggplant. It's such a common and basic ingredient, yet it wasn't always the case. On the flip side of the coin, the other item, sort of the other topic that I tried to cover in the book, was how did Italians influence Jewish food in Italy, obviously. And that is it's a surprising topic, because you would think that Italians wouldn't care or wouldn't influence Jewish food, and that would be a problem of the Jews. However, there's been a number of regulations and a number of ultimately political forms of oppressions that the Pope and mostly the Pope, actually, the Pope himself, enforced on Jews, which determined the way Jewish food evolved. And here are a couple of those stories, and we get to why I asked you to keep in mind the whole existence of the notion of the ghetto. So at some point, the Pope decided to lock the Jews in ghettos to keep them away from the Christians. So far, so good. Let's take the ghetto of Rome. That's probably the most interesting one. And let's take the example of these two dishes that I have in my slide on the right. The ghetto was in a really undesirable area of Rome. The situation was very difficult for the Jews there. Poverty, overpopulation, like the ghetto was very small and the Jews were living one on top of each other. Really tough life. The ghetto was in this neighborhood that nobody wanted to live in, because it was just by the river Tiber, in a very unhealthy area, which was also home to the fish market. Nobody wanted to live there. That's why they set the ghetto there specifically. So what would the Jews do? They were really poor. They were locked in the ghetto. A number of jobs they couldn't have, because the Pope had restricted the jobs that the Jews could perform to very few. They could sell rags, they could do like all sorts of undesirable jobs. So the Jews were poor and stuck in the ghetto, but the ghetto was near the fish market. So what would the Jewish women do? They would go to the fish market at the end of the market day, collect whatever scraps of fishes, tails and heads, whatever was left after the market day. And the only sanitary way to cook that fish after a full day sitting outside in the sun at the market was to boil it, right? So the Jewish women started to make this fish soup that over the centuries developed into what is today a local specialty. If you visit Rome, everybody loves the zuppa di pesce. However, the zuppa di pesce wasn't originally, a fancy, delightful, high-end meal. It was a dish born out of poverty, because the Jewish women of the ghetto had access to virtually nothing else. So do we remember this story? Again, obviously not. When we eat this dish, we think of it as just yet another delicious Roman Italian dish. However, I like to sort of tell the story to bring back the humble origins of this dish, which I think are worth knowing. Another dish that people today think of as a local delicacy, sort of, is aliciotti con l'indivia. If you ever visit, for example, the ghetto, or a lot of Roman restaurants, you can try this. It's like a pie, it's a bake of anchovies and curly endive. You would think that it's just a dish like another. However, it's not. At some point, the Pope decided that the Jews were not allowed any nice fishes. The only fish that the Jews could eat were the tiny ones. So we were only allowed, for some reason, because the Pope was temperamental like that, we were only allowed sardines and anchovies, and the teeny weeny sort of undesirable fishes where there's nothing to eat. It was a luxury law. It was the Pope saying that the Jews were not allowed any luxury. Now, as I told you, there were no luxuries, so I don't know what luxuries the Pope was picturing in his head. However, anyway, he decided to restrict the fish that we could eat. So we were left only with the anchovies and the sardines. Then he also decided to rule over the salads that the Jews could eat. So it was like, they can have salads, yes, but they cannot have them with meat and they cannot have them with eggs. And again, why? I don't know. Who knows? The Pope was just really mean like that. So the Jews were left with salads that they couldn't eat with meat and eggs, and with these tiny shitty fishes, excuse my French, that nobody would want to eat. So again, the women of the ghetto were like, fine, let's see what we can do. And they started making this dish, which, you know, once you put some good olive oil and a bit of garlic and a bit of chili pepper, is actually quite delicious. Would they have wanted to make that dish? Probably not. Did the social and political and economical conditions that Italy imposed on the Jews determine the birth of this dish? Absolutely. So that was the other thing that I tried to record in the book, to go back to the original question, what goes in this book. The other aspect that I tried to record is how some dishes were born out of pretty much like oppression and poverty and like discrimination, however, resulted in great local specialties that we still really appreciate to this day. I love these stories because I think that they really prove how, even in the hardest circumstances, if one is crafty and creative and has goodwill, it's possible to come up with something really delicious. So I usually skip this slide because I always speak to a Jewish audience, but since today this is not a Jewish audience, I'll take a quick step back to talk to you about eating kosher, just like, you know, the basics. Because the other aspect that I tried to record in the book, and we're going to talk about more in detail, is the fact that the need to eat kosher also determined what the Jews of Italy would eat and not eat, obviously, in their daily life, what the Jewish diet would look like. So just in case we don't know, here are just a few notes. Kosher animals that you really need to know about are practically all of them, like, you know, the cow, the sheep, the goat. However, we don't eat any weird animals, so we don't eat camels, I don't know, pigs. Pigs are not allowed, but pork is not allowed, but I guess everybody knows that. We are allowed fowls, geese, and ducks, which is a piece of information that you want to keep in mind, because eventually the Jews of Italy became particularly crafty at cooking goose. So you need to know that that's allowed. We're not allowed any seafood other than regular fishes that have scales and fins. So, you know, no fritto misto for us. For those of you who know what fritto misto is, no fried crustaceans and things like that. Our meat is slaughtered differently from regular meat because eating blood is forbidden. So our meat is prepared slightly different than the one at a regular butcher. And then the last thing that I ask you that's really actually relevant to our conversation to keep in mind is that there is a rule in the Bible that you will not mix in the same meal meat and milk, which for extension also means any meaty or milky products. So in one meal in my household, I would either decide that I cook meat or that I cook milk, or that I don't cook one or the other. This is really relevant because when you start thinking about Italian food, and I'm just gonna blurt out the first one that comes to mind, lasagna. It really happens quite often that we have meat and milk in the same dish. So it's an inconvenience that the Jews had to deal with. So how did these needs, the need of keeping kosher and the need to stick to these rules, determine how the Jews of Italy ate? Well, they ate like the Christians did. Like I said, they still wanted to be able to eat lasagna. They still wanted to be able to eat prosciutto, for example. But all of these things were not allowed. So the Jews had to figure out how to make similar dishes without breaking the Jewish rules. So, for example, you would still eat lasagna, but you would make it slightly differently. How? With three tricks that I find really define how the Jewish people cooked versus the Christians. They would swap broth for milk and oil for butter. So, for example, when I make lasagna, still to this day in my household, I would make a bechamel sauce that is not made with milk and butter like we would regularly in Italy. It's made with broth and oil. It's very similar. You couldn't tell the difference if I didn't, spill the tea and told you my secret. It looks similar, it tastes similar. The butter one is slightly better. I mean, if I could, I would have butter. But it's the resulting dish is pretty much a lasagna. Is it identical to the Catholic one? Of course not. Also, would my bolognese sauce have pork? No, it would be all beef. So the other aspect that I try to record is how even Italian food, when we think about it as actual Italian food, had a slightly different sauce when it became Jewish. So, for example, again, another one of these examples would be the crostata that you see on the side, the pie. We also wanted to eat crostata or like cookies or any other dessert that people would actually usually make with butter. However, due to the fact that we're not allowed to mix meat and milk, not even 3 hours one from each other, most of the Jews of Italy would just not cook with butter. You would make your pastries with oil, not necessarily olive oil. I was about to say olive oil, but you would use a number of other types of oil, but with oil instead of butter, so that there is no risk that you accidentally eat some meat before or after, and then you break the rule of keeping meat and milk separate. Another interesting Jewish preparation way of preparing food was the adoption of goose instead of pork. Pork we're not allowed, but we're allowed goose. And it turns out you can take a goose, treat it like pork, cure it like pork, and what you would get is pretty similar to pork. Now, is it identical? Obviously not. But can you still make a prosciutto? Can you still make a salami? Can you still make charcuterie products that are similar to the ones you make with pork? Yes, you can. So the Jews didn't want to give up on all of those things. They just had to figure out a way to make them Jewish or to make them, kosher, appropriate. So this was another aspect of the culinary Jewish tradition that I tried to record in the book. Because, like I said, lasagna remains an Italian dish. We cannot claim lasagna for the Jews, but there is a Jewish way to prepare it, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the reasons why I set out to write this book really is that there are not many people left that still prepare some of these dishes. In particular, for example, the goose prosciutto. In the entirety of Italy, I was able to find 2 people that still make it. So I got a little bit anxious because these were elderly people, and there isn't much of a generational interchange here. Like, a lot of these recipes are gonna be lost and forgotten unless somebody set out to sort of record them and try to give them, another life. So that's what I eventually ended up doing by writing the book. I tried to at least give these recipes and stories some recorded history, so that for the future they can live on, and hopefully they will live on in your kitchen or someone else's kitchen. We still have time, so I'll try really quickly to take you through a little journey through Italy and tell you, first of all, where the relevant Jewish communities and where the relevant Jewish culture is to be found for those who are, maybe ever going to visit Italy and have some Jewish interest, and tell you a little bit about the food of those areas. Why wouldn't my slides change? Here we go. So we're going to start from the south, because what you want to know about the south of Italy is that central and southern Italy were the places where the first Jews established themselves. So remember how I told you that at some point some Jews settled during the Judeo-Roman Wars? Those were the Jews. They settled in southern Italy, in Sicily, and in Rome. Now, they resided there until the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, 1492, which we discussed previously. So those communities don't exist anymore. Like today in southern Italy, there's pretty much nothing of Jewish interest. There's a couple of tiny Jewish communities, but there's pretty much nothing of Jewish interest because, like I said, at some point the Jews were expelled from there and they never looked back. However, these Jews were really relevant from a culinary perspective because, like I said, they were merchants. They had great exposure to the rest of the world. So they brought to southern Italy, and in particular to Sicily, a number of ingredients that Italians didn't cook with. I mentioned earlier the eggplant, but the same goes for artichokes, for fennel, for cardoons, and for a number of other ingredients that Italians were really not familiar with. So that's what you want to remember for southern Italy. And like I said, if you visit, unfortunately, there isn't much to visit, but it's still a great place for vacation. Those Jews moved mostly later on to Rome. They migrated up north. Rome is, to this day, our largest community in Italy. There's about, depending how you count, let's round it up to 15,000 Jews in Rome. The remaining Jews are mostly in Milan and then sprinkled throughout the peninsula, but Rome is really the biggest Jewish hub in Italy. And like I said, that's still peanuts compared to any American city. So not many Jews, but Jews with a fascinating story. I told you about the existence of the ghetto. Now, the ghetto today, obviously, we don't have ghettos anymore in that sense, because after Napoleon freed the country, the ghettos just didn't happen any longer. But the ghetto in Rome is still the place where the ghetto was is still pretty much the heart of the Jewish community. It's where our temple is, it's where the Jewish school is. So that's actually a place that is worth visiting if you ever come to Italy and have some interest in Jewish culture, because there's a lot to see. There's also a lot to eat, because I want to say Rome has probably the most interesting Jewish Italian cuisine to eat. Now, if you're going to try just one dish out of the Jewish Roman cuisine, it's probably the dish that you see here in the picture to the right. That thing is a cookie. It's a huge cookie. It's like a cookie the size of my hand. It's a huge cookie called pizza de beridde, which we prepare in the occasion of Brit Milas, which are like the birth of, I guess, of a son. I'm simplifying, but bear with me, and for other joyous occasions. This is a dish that usually looks really ugly. It's traditionally pretty burnt, mostly because it has raisins and the raisins tend to burn, but it's very, very delicious, so it's definitely worth trying if you're ever in town. It's called, like I said, pizza. Now, you will agree with me that that has nothing to do with pizza, like it doesn't look like a pizza. However, the Romans have this habit of calling pizza a number of things that were flat. So they have pizzarelle, which are like fritters, they have pizzelle, which are like burgers, and they have this cookie, which they call pizza de beridde. So don't be surprised if you get something called a pizza that is not a pizza. Another region of Jewish interest is Tuscany. It's not a really big community today, but it used to be. Tuscany was home to very many Jews, mostly because the politicians and the institutions that ran Tuscany in the old days were very open-minded, and they understood that the Jews would bring with them wealth and education and opportunities, because these were well-traveled people. So the region of Tuscany was very welcoming to the Jews for very many centuries, especially the city of Leghorn. And so the Jews contributed a lot to the local cuisine. A story that I like to tell is the story of triglie alla mosaica. I don't have a picture, so I can't put it here, but one day I'll take a decent picture and put it in these slides. Triglie alla mosaica are a type of fish. Triglie are red mullets in English. And alla mosaica means in the style of Moses. Now, when you start looking into archival and documental evidence, there's a number of recipes that have been recorded with weird sounding names like in the style of Moses, or in the style of Judith, or in the style of Miriam, like stuff with Jewish names, Moses being the main one. So every time a dish had a name like that, it was typically a Jewish dish. Now, today, there is a dish in the city of Leghorn that is called triglie, so the usual fish, the red mullets, alla livornese, in the style of Leghorn. Accidentally, that dish is exactly the same dish that we used to call triglie alla mosaica, triglie in the style of Moses. For some reason, the style of Moses got sort of lost, and we now just call it, the fish is in the style of the city. However, like I said, it wasn't always the case. It was a Jewish dish, or a dish of Jewish origin, which eventually people sort of forgot, or got lost in translation. So, and that's just one of the again, another one of those very many stories where there was a Jewish history that people have overseen over time. Moving further up north, there are the region of Piedmont and Lombardy. That's actually where I come from. I come from Lombardy, from the city of Milano. Piedmont is a very interesting region. Now, most people wouldn't have time to visit if they just come to Italy for a short trip. But if you had the chance to visit Piedmont a bit extensively, it's a very interesting region that has a really long Jewish history. And there are a few small towns that are absolutely adorable, where there used to be Jewish communities, and where you can still visit the synagogues that are architectural jewels. So they would be well worth visiting if someone was really interested into Jewish topics. In Lombardy, today Milan is a big community, but Milan is not a community with a long history. It's a relatively young community. In the old days, the biggest city of Jewish interest in the region would have been Mantua. And what is another cute story to know is how today we think of pumpkin as a local Mantuan specialty specifically, or like as a local regional specialty. But again, pumpkin wasn't a thing until the Jews came. The Jews brought pumpkin with them because they thought it was a well-wishing ingredient. They thought it brought good luck. They prepared it for the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. And eventually the locals started to cook it too, and they learned what to make with this weird vegetable. But the story would have remained pretty much like the eggplant, that if the Jews didn't teach the locals how to cook with pumpkin, they would have pretty much never adopted it. The last stop of our tour of Italy brings us up north, more towards Eastern Europe, to the cities of Venice and Trieste. These are two communities that had a very interesting history, because the Jews that settled there came from a number of different places, which resulted in a melting pot of cultures and ingredients and recipes that is really interesting. Actually, when I wrote this book, it was very tempting to over-represent Rome, because Rome has the Jewish cuisine that people know the most about. But in reality, I believe that the most interesting place from a culinary perspective is actually Venice, because Venice was home to three communities. There was the German Jews that arrived to Italy from Germany. There were the Ponentini Jews that came from Spain and Portugal. And then there were the Levantini Jews that came from the Levant, so from Egypt, Syria, and Turkey. Every one of these communities brought with them specific ingredients or cooking methods that were very unique and really deeply influenced the way the Jews of Italy started to cook. The Tedeschi Jews brought with them the habit of cooking with goose and duck. Italians were not particularly keen on goose and duck, but it turns out that goose and duck can easily be farmed, especially up north, because the weather is favorable and they thrive in there. So that's how the goose became a Jewish ingredient, and that's how the Jews got the idea that maybe they could use this animal, which they would have in everybody's courtyard type of thing, very easily accessible, instead of pork, which is exactly the same concept, because the Catholic would just have porks running around their yards, and so the Jews figured that they could do the same with goose and then treat the animal the same way. To go back to the influence, the Ponentini Jews brought a number of other ingredients that were exquisitely Jewish, that today we still think of as Jewish. They brought the marzipan and the usage of almond very much in baking. Citruses. Italians did obviously farm oranges and lemons, but citron, which is the other sort of weird lemon that I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but you can look it up. It's called citron. Was a specifically Jewish type of product. And then there were the Levantini Jews that brought us, and this is another story that I really obsess over, many different ingredients, but more than anything, the preparation that we today call saor. If you visit Venice, the Venetians are very proud, a bit like the Apulians are proud of the orecchiette. The Venetians are very proud of this dish that you see in the picture to the right called sarde in saor. Sarde are sardines, but big ones. They're really like chubby sardines that are prepared with this technique called saor, which is a sweet and sour preparation with vinegar, onion, raisins, and pine nuts. Now, if you ask in Venice, the people of Venice, is this a Venetian dish? They'll tell you, yes, it's a local specialty, we're very proud of it. However, it wasn't the Venetians that came up with the idea. It was the Levantini Jews that used to trade with Venice and the corresponding countries over in the Mediterranean, so with Egypt, Syria, and Turkey, that used to preserve fish for the long journeys over sea with this specific preparation. And the first recorded versions of this dish that we have prove it quite clearly. So is it a Venetian dish? Absolutely. Do the people of Venice think of it as a Venetian local specialty? True. But was it originally a Jewish dish? Also true. And I promise at some point I'll stop highlighting the Jewish history of things. But it's just, I just find it really interesting how a lot of these stories have sort of gotten lost. And so I'm just trying to bring them back to light. So this is it on my end for the time being. If you have any questions or any questions that you're shy to ask now, you can email me. Or if you just want to, go ahead and ask a question, that would be the perfect time to do so.
Okay, you can either put them questions in your chat and I'll call on you, or if you raise your hand, I can try to recognize you if you want to ask a question right now. Anybody have any questions? I don't see any right now. Okay, is it Kathleen Anuli? If you unmute, you can ask your question. Kathleen?
Whoops. Yes, I was just wondering what Pope put the Jews in the ghettos?
What Pope?
Yeah.
I wish I remembered. We're gonna have to find that out. We're gonna have to Google that. I'm gonna have to admit my ignorance because I completely forgot. The Pope also have this habit of calling themselves name 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's always hard to remember which one is which. So the Pope that put the Jews in the ghetto was, it appears to be Pope Paul IV. In 1555, like I said, in fact, at the beginning. Now, like I said, the popes have this habit of calling themselves Paul 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's always one of those. But that's the one we're looking for.
I have another question here from Leslie Guyoti. What was Jewish population prior to World War II, and how many emigrated to Israel after 1948?
Very valid question. I love that you asked me this question, which gives me the chance to go back to some more history. So the Jewish population right before the war, no, let me frame it another way. The Jews of Italy have not been very hardly hit by World War II, as you would imagine for, you know, Poland or Germany or a number of other countries that had a much worse time. Italians were very hesitant since the beginning to go with the whole Nazi thing. We did have the fascists. They were slightly less bad than the Nazi. So we weren't hit as hard by the Shoah, by the Holocaust. So after the war, the community shrank, but it didn't shrink hugely. A number of people left to Israel, a number of people left to the US, but not that very many. However, we're always talking peanuts numbers, like we said at the beginning, in proportion. Like, we're always talking about really small communities. So what happened to the Italian community? Something very interesting. So Italy used to be a colonial power at some point, not a big one, not like the UK or like others, but Italy used to have a colony. That colony of Italy was Libya. That's where my family comes from. Libya is in North Africa, and at some point, after the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, a number of Arab countries that had a Jewish population, among which was Libya, decided that they didn't like their Jews anymore. So they started to have pogroms and attacks against the Jews. So a number of Jews from the Arab world at some point had to leave. The Jews of Libya, like other Jews from other places, found that Italy was a really convenient destination just across the Mediterranean, relatively easy to reach. Some of them already had contacts with this country because, like I said, for example, in the case of Libya, Libya was an Italian colony. So the Jews of all of those countries left, and some of them left to Italy. Now, some of them left to Italy and then they moved to like Israel. Some left to Italy and they stayed. And thus, the Italian Jewish population, which was shrinking after the war, it was also shrinking, by the way, for other cultural reasons that we can look into later. But the population that was shrinking got like a little bit of a replenishment through the Jews of the Arab world that had to flee the Arab countries, to the point that today, for example, Milan, that's where I come from, that's a new Jewish community in a way, not only because it doesn't have a long history, but because it's a lot, in good part, composed of Jews that came from other places. We've got lots of Jews from Libya, we got lots of Jews from Lebanon, we've got Jews from Iran, lots of those too. The Persian Jews, we got Jews from all over the place. So at some point we were lucky that the shrinking community sort of benefited from immigration of from other places, and somehow replenished itself. That is actually why in my book I tried to also record, although, you know, just in passing, because that was not the topic, a couple of the recipes that these other Jews brought to Italy, because now their recipes are practically part of the Italian repertoire, despite the fact that they're not originally Italian. I hope that more or less answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Benedetta. Also, I know there's a Shoah memorial in Milan alongside the railroad station, because there was one particular track there underground,
Yeah.
where the fascists in Northern Italy, Milan used to unfortunately send Jews out to
Correct.
Germany, different concentration camps. But I also read a figure that 80% of Italian Jews during the Holocaust did manage to survive, and there were a number of
Correct.
the internment camps and concentration camps in Italy were quite different. They didn't really, to some extent, have barbed wire, and there was more. I actually know this. I've been studying it because my parents' town in Abruzzo was one of
Mhm.
those internment camps, and it turns out the mayor of the town is a righteous Gentile enshrined in.
So exactly, and that's the other thing that I was about to say. I sort of got sidetracked. The other thing is Italians love breaking rules. And they have a strong sense for some reason of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. Now that served us well during World War II, because a lot of Italians felt that the regulations and the discriminations that were happening against Jews were wrong. So not that many, but a number of people took action to save the Jews. And they hid them in their basements. They helped them smuggle themselves through the border to Switzerland. So while there weren't many, there were surely quite a few Italians that felt that what was happening was wrong, and they decided to help the Jews. So definitely that helped. And the other thing that helped was how, independently of their feeling towards the Jews in particular, Italy did harbor a certain sense of resistance against fascism and against the Nazi. So we had what we call the partisans, which were people that were fighting against the political oppression, and that sort of also helped and facilitate the escape of Jews. So in that respect, we were definitely very lucky, much luckier than, like I said, the Jews of other countries.
Yes. Also, before we go on to that, there is one concentration camp in Trieste.
Correct.
Elsewhere extermination did take place at Old Rice Factory. Yes.
I do like to
Thank you.
mention a thing that makes
Yeah.
me very happy to this day is that where there used to be this concentration camp, now, like in the same town, now we have a summer camp for Jewish kids. So I guess we overcame that story, and today there's a happy thing happening there. But yeah, that definitely happened. But nothing compared to Germany, nothing compared to Poland, to give it some perspective.
So, also, somebody had asked, is there one special Jewish Italian food served during Passover? Marissa put some recipes in from your book, but is there one special food that's
Good question.
Jewish?
So yes, of course there are a few. Like I said, Italy is a very geographically fragmented country. So depending in which region you are, as most of you would be familiar with also for non-Jewish recipes, depending on the region, the food can change a lot. So up in the north of Italy, I would say a classic Passover dish is daieno, which is a soup that has eggs scrambled in it. I'm simplifying a bit, but scrambled eggs in it, and matzah, sort of broken in pieces. Down in Rome, I would say the one dish that comes to mind really for Passover is pizzarelle. Pizzarelle are, again, to go to the topic of things that are flat and they call them pizza, even if they have nothing to do with pizza. Pizzarelle are like, some of you might be familiar with American matzah bread, which is like some sort of a fritter made with matzah. Pizzarelle are similar. They are tiny bites of matzah, which is soaked and then smooshed and then fried. And then they're served with honey, so they're a dessert. Pizzarelle are a very Roman thing to do for Passover. What else? These are the two things that come to mind, but there's very many, obviously. But very traditional, these are two of them.
I think we have two more questions. One from Lori.
I'm in no rush. You can ask all the questions you want.
So is it very difficult to get matzah, and is there a traditional Seder of sorts?
Yeah, good question. So no, we do get matzah fairly easily. Now, if you ask me about how hard it is to keep Passover in Italy versus the US, it's a whole other world. Because in the US, there are many Jews. So you guys here command a larger market. So when I moved to the US, I went to the Jewish kosher store for Passover, and I was shocked about the amount of Passover products that people get here, because there's all of these delicious cookies and cakes and things. It practically is not even Passover because there's so many options. You don't really have to deprive yourself of anything. In Italy, the options are really, truly limited. You get one type of cookie. It's rock hard. It's not particularly pleasant. In recent years, we started to get a tiny bit few other products, but it was fairly hard to keep Passover as a Jew in Italy until a few years ago. Like, you got the matzo, but that was it. The rest you really had to, cook for yourself if you wanted to have a Passover, kosher for Passover cakes or kosher for Passover cookies.
Is there a Seder and
So we all, yeah, definitely. So we do the Seder like people do here. I want to say the main difference is that we don't use horseradish, because horseradish is a specifically Ashkenazi tradition. So instead of horseradish, we use two different types of salad. We generally have some really bitter salad, like, endive or some other like bitter salad instead of the horseradish. But everything else in the Passover Seder would be the same. So we got the eggs, we got the lamb. Whatever you would do for Passover in America, we would do the same in Italy. Just the horseradish would be different. There is another question, I believe. I just got from Kathleen.
Yes, it's not a question, but one question. The Ashkenazi Jews were from where again? Were they the ones from Spain?
Oh, in general in life, they're the ones that come from Poland, Eastern Europe. Those are the ones we call Ashkenazi. And the Sephardi ones are the ones that come from the Mediterranean.
Okay.
So most of the Jews that you will meet in America are Ashkenazi, because those are Jews that left Eastern Europe for the US.
Okay, so one question and one comment. So the 35,000 Jews that are in Italy now, are most of them, what's the word I want? Not kosher Jews.
Sephardic? Are they Sephardic or Mizrahi?
No, Orthodox Jews.
Good question. That's another excellent question. So in Italy, as a Jew, you don't really have much choice, because we don't do Reformed. Reformed are not a thing. They tried. There's like 10 of them. They're like the rebellious kids. So Reformed we don't really do. They try. I see somebody sending the link to them. It's somebody that came from the US and was like, let's try. Let's do this. Didn't really work. They've got like I said, I think 15 people. Cute attempt, not sticking. So the remaining Jews, other than those 15, they have no choice, because our level of Judaism as a country as a whole is fairly Orthodox. Now, at the same time, we're Italians. We break rules all the time, because that's what Italians do. So we are Orthodox in principle, then the execution is sort of, there's loose ends.
Heads and heads.
Yeah, so like, for example, I went to the Jewish school. They raised us proper Jewish. Then later on, everybody does the best they can. But you don't have a real official way to be Jewish that is not properly Orthodox, because that's pretty much what there is.
Okay. And then the other thing, I just wanted to recommend a book called It Happened in Italy. And it's a good story, a true story about a man who a Jewish man who lived in New York, was saved by the Italian Jews, a small town in Italy. And a woman hears him speak at one of the universities and realizes that he's talking about the town that her parents came from. So she helps him write this book, and she takes him back to Italy, and he gets a wonderful welcome and all of that.
Oh, that's such a nice
It's a really charming book. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called It Happened in Italy. And I had no idea about what happened with the Southern Jews, but they didn't, they only, at least from this area, they only had curfews, and they could go to the same hospitals, the same schools, and mix, dance around with everybody, but they just had to be in by like 11 o'clock or something.
So Italy had very many ghettos in very many cities. So each city, given the political fragmentation of Italy, could do more or less whatever they wanted. So it depends where you were.
And when the Nazis came, they hid them in the wine caves. The town people hid them in the wine caves. So it's a good story of courage and what people can do when they put their mind to it.
We'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we just have one more question because I think it's getting late, 6:33. If we want to take Carolina, I guess, asked if you lived in New York, but we know you live in Santa Monica, California now.
No, I don't live in New York, but to answer her question, because I did see it. So the problem with Jewish Italian food is that it's really not very well known. I happen to come to New York quite often, and I am not aware of anything that would answer her request. There is, I mean, you can get Italian food, and you can definitely get some, in the case of Roman food is easier because a lot of the Roman food is also Jewish of origin. But I don't know anyone that decided to make it a thing specifically to be Jewish Italian. So you can find good Roman food. You can find other different types of Italian food, but specifically with a focus on Jewish, it's not a thing that I know of.
Well, Ina has in the comments that Latanzi restaurant in New York is Roman, but not kosher. And Marissa recommends Trastevere. Is that in Brooklyn? Okay.
Yes,
it's kosher.
There is one. It's in Brooklyn, Coney Island, called Trastevere, and it both specializes in dishes. I think mostly Roman dishes, but and it is kosher.
Yeah. Actually, I'm looking at the menu of the one that you guys sent called Trastevere. That one does have a few Jewish Italian dishes, like things that I would call Jewish Italian. So you taught me something.
Great.
Wasn't Trastevere the Jewish section of Rome?
Correct. That's
right.
More or less. Definitely.
And there's also we had a program last year. It was during COVID with Rabbi Barbara Aiello. She's Italy's first woman rabbi,
right.
And her parents are from Calabria, but she was actually born in Pittsburgh, and then she decided to go back. She became a rabbi, and she resurrected, if it's correct word, this 500-year-old synagogue in Calabria that had been, hidden because during the Inquisition, different issues. Anyway, so she now has her own congregation there, and she did a program for us. It's probably on our YouTube channel if you ever want to see it. But she does a lot of things. She live streams. I know she's done, I can't remember the name of the concentration camp, but there's one right near her in Calabria where she does Rosh Hashanah services. Yeah, and she also has done Tu B'Shavat, which is the holiday in January of the harvest. And she's done, I don't know if she's done a Seder, but she does a lot of live streaming of different services. And she does historical research on names and how they can trace them to Jewish roots or Italian last names. And you can find her at Rabbi Barbara.
Sorry, I do feel like she speaks to a mostly American audience. For some reason, she's best known almost abroad than she is in Italy. In Italy, most people would think that it's wrong to have a woman rabbi, like really wrong. I thoroughly support it. I love Reform Judaism in the US. It opened my eyes to a number of possibilities that I didn't know were a thing. But for most Italians in Italy, for most Jews in Italy, already saying that there's a woman rabbi, people be like, oh, what weirdness is that?
Right.
So she's doing a terrific job. And what she did to revive Calabria as a Jewish region, where, like I said, there's pretty much nothing left in southern Italy, is a miracle in itself. It's almost like the fact that she's American that allowed her to come with a different attitude that the Jews of Italy would have never had, because, like I said, a woman rabbi, etc., would be really weird.
All right, great. Well, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much. And if
thank you very much
for
spending this.
You saw my email. You're most welcome to reach out.
Yes, I guess. Do we put Benedetta's email in the chat, so everybody wants to write her.
I can do that.
Okay, and we recorded this, so we will either send you a copy tomorrow if you want and post it probably to our YouTube, so you can refer back to it or share it with friends who missed
Awesome.
tonight. All right. Well, thanks again. Thank you, Benedetta. Thank you,
everybody.
Marissa, for hanging in.
Good
Thank you,
night.
everyone, for tuning in. Appreciate it. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.